Alright. You guys have been asking about front end swaps on the double overhead cam bikes, and I'll show every trick I can think of to help make it easier on you and help you not hurt any parts. And I'll show you how to use a more modern front end, like with the GSXR this came out of, everybody's so crazy about, and I'll also show you why I'm more inclined to use the early CBR stuff. And there's a 96 CBR 600, a F2 complete set of yokes, and here's a stock twin cam set, and they're not that different, which is a good thing in my opinion, and I'll show you why. Several times I've mentioned the offset of the yokes, the difference of the center line of the fork legs to the center line of the steering stem, and the reason that's so important is when you do a front end swap, that's all you're doing. It's just a front end swap. You're not changing the geometry of the entire chassis or the steering neck angle, so you've got to try as best as you can to remain similar to the stock dimensions so that you're not completely out in left field on handling and steering geometry. A lot of the modern sport bikes, especially the GSXR front end that everybody likes so much, they have nearly no offset. If you were to take a straight edge and lay across the center line of the fork leg, you'd find that the center line of the steering stem is much closer. I think they're actually about 15 millimeters of offset. The early CBRs run, I think, somewhere around 35 millimeters, 32 to 35 millimeters of offset, and the stock trees run, I think, in the mid 40s. So you're still, even with the CBR front end, you're losing offset, and you're effectively drawing the forks closer to the bike than what they're designed to be, but it's minimal, especially compared to more modern bikes. But that's not why we're here. Alright, so you want to swap the front ends. The easiest way to go about doing it is take your steering stem that fits your bike, your chassis, which is this one right here, and insert it into whatever bottom yoke you want. But you have to be able to also reinstall the matching top yoke on the existing stem, and that's where the CBR stuff really makes life easy, and I'll show you why later. But first things first, these are older bikes. You got steel stems, you got steel yokes, unlike the modern stuff which is all aluminum. So while these stems are pressed into these yokes, they're also welded. Now, not all bikes are like this, but the Hondas are. And not only they're welded 360 degrees, so you have to grind that out before you can press the stem out. And I'll show you how to do that now. One thing about when you're grinding this off or sanding it off, or even if you don't have any power tools, air tools, you got to file it off. You can get it off. You don't need a bunch of specialized tools for this, but they help. But one thing I've seen people do, I've seen build threads online, and apparently people are getting away with it or whatever, but I'd be afraid to try it. Don't clamp when you're holding this to grind it. If you're using a vise, don't clamp it in the vise. This is a precision bearing area, and these things aren't, if you can see, or you'll see, they're not particularly all that thick. So if you really bear down on that in a vise, for one, you can leave jaw marks in your bearing area, which is make putting your bearing on really difficult, or you could actually distort the pipe, the stem, because it's just a fairly thin wall piece of pipe. So just don't, this is what we're doing this for. This is the piece we want, so don't clamp by that piece. These old yokes, nobody wants them. Just clamp her in by an ear on the yoke, and that should give you a good place to get to it, and everybody out here is nice and safe. Alright, so we got the welds cleaned up on the bottom of the yoke. They're ready to press apart now, and this might just be my personal opinion, but you can hurt a stem real quick like this, and this is how I press them apart to protect them. If you don't have any type of nut or anything to press against at all, like I said earlier, it's a really thin wall. When you start pressing on this thing, you're probably just going to collapse the tube. I know you're collapse the tube, no doubt about it. You can, and I've done this before in the past, you can put the top nut on as far as you can get, you know, save a thread or two so you're not all the way down, and put a soft piece of metal in there, brass, aluminum or something, and press against that, and you'll probably be just fine. But what I like to do is the double nuts that you have for your top bearing, I usually go ahead and I press against that area instead, and double them up twice as thick, a little bit stronger, and you'll need spacers to reach past it to press against. But the reason I do that is not all top nuts are like this. A lot of them have a little sheet metal dome, decorative tops, and pressing against them just ruins them. So if you press against this down here, you've got two nuts, a lot larger diameter, and it's just easier in general to press against. And on the bottom, when you go to press them out, remember you need clearance for the stem to come out, because you're going to press it out from the bottom. You could press it this way, but you'd have to make a special tool that would be the exact size or a little under what the stem is, and you're not going to make that at home. And even if you had the tools to make it, you're not going to spend the time to do it, so we end up pressing them out that direction. So remember, you need room out of the bottom, so again, put some sort of a spacer that'll support it solidly, and get your top nuts. You're done, ready to go. And I'll go ahead and get these pressed out, and we'll go to the next step. Alright, just going to run over something real quick here about when you grind this weld off. Of course, you can tell I turned mine off on the lathe because I got a freshly painted car beside me and I didn't want a bunch of sparks. So, but when you grind that thing, give yourself a nice, flat as you can, area around it through these webs and all. That way when you're pressing on it, it's not quite as floppy. You actually have a somewhat of a base or a foundation to stand on. Of course, you're still going to have to put some kind of spacer under it, but if you do that, that'll help you immensely. Alright, over at the just going to press this out so y'all can see how little pressure it actually takes to do this. I was talking about using spacers on the bottom, so this has got room to come through. I just got a hole in my plate and just a little spacer up here so this can extend over the stem. And but this one has still got the bearing on the bottom, which is not really a huge deal. Sometimes the bearing and the steering stem have rust, or they kind of freeze together. Can make it really stiff, harder to come off than it should be, harder than you want to press on all this. And if that's the case, you got to stop, remove a bearing. If you're running that, I'll show you how. But typically it'll come on off. But I'm just going to show you, not much to see here, but show you that it doesn't take a lot of pressure to do this. If you're pressing yours and it's really taking any amount of pressure at all, then stop and figure out what the problem is, because it should go right on. Get down here right. There it goes. Alright. It's loose. It's out. The nut spin by hand means you didn't hurt any threads, so you got a happy, healthy stem. Alright, now that sound you just heard, that pop when I was pressing it, that was the sound of me being a hypocrite, basically. If you look at this thing, you see this rough edge right there, and this is nice and clean. You see that or not? You get that bad edge. I wasn't all the way through the weld, so when I pressed that, it actually stretched and just snapped that metal. It stretched it until it broke. That's what that popping sound was. And I should have been taking my own advice, stopping, figuring out what the problem was, grinding that off, and going back at it. But anyways, that's what that was. Alright, so we got the stems pressed out. Here is what I was talking about earlier. I'll explain why I am partial to the CBR front ends. I think you can read what those are. Every dimension between these two match, except for the obvious difference in overall length. The threads, the diameters, the distance between everything's a match. The reason this is so handy is this is a CBR bottom yoke. When I go to put the stem in this bottom yoke, it fits this yoke. It'll just press right in, done. And it also fits the CBR top yoke where this sits on its register, and everything fits. Not only is this diameter the same as a stock yoke, but the overall thickness is the same. So when this bearing goes on here, and then you've got your two lock nuts, and then your top yoke sits on there, everything fits like it should. Simple, easy, not an issue. Now comparing the CB stem to a GSXR stem, and I'll show you. First of all, this down here, the diameter is a fair amount larger. There's two ways to go about this. One, you can run beads of weld down the stem all the way around it, time consuming, keeping it cold so you don't warp it. Turn it back down off on the lathe, press it in. That's one option. Your other option is take your bottom yoke, and you have to have a machine to do this. Bore this out, press in a bushing. This is just for an example. Press in a bushing that fits nice and tight, that has a correct inside diameter to take your stock stem, then that fits. And then you're going to have to redo this process all over again on the top yoke. You have to bore this out, press in a spacer, and then bore the inside of the spacer out to fit this. All extra processes that you can't do at home, you're going to have to hire done unless you have a lathe and everything. And you have to have a pretty decent sized lathe. Mine's 10.5 inches, and you see I have to knock the ears off this to get this to fit. But that's the reason it's just so handy, being able to use the F3, the F2, the F3 stuff versus everything else. Everything else is doable, but for a guy with limited tools at home that just wants better suspension, CBR is the way to go. Now, this is CBR bottom yoke. This is the CB bottom yoke, and when you go to press this in, you can't just press it till it's flush where the other one was flush, and it'll fit. It don't work that easy, because these are not the exact same. These are not the exact same distance or thickness, I should say. You can see the difference in there. What you need to do is, however much stem was protruding before, you need to recreate that into your new bottom yoke. And this is the easiest way I found to do without messing up. Get you a nice mark. My Sharpie's a little dried up apparently. There we go. Mark that out. Here's the original bottom yoke. Take my calipers and whatever this dimension is, you will just scribe it, transfer that length, and you see that little scribe mark. Now what that mark is, that is exactly when you press into your new stem where you need to end at this surface. That way, when your bottom bearing presses down, hits against this, you get the exact factory dimension from your bottom bearing to where your top bearing ends, so everything lands where it should. It'll fit the bike. You won't end up with your bearing is running into this edge where you get the stem too high or you get the stem too low, and your bearing is burying some of these threads. That puts you right where you need to be. But when you go to press this through, you're going to wipe this mark off because it is a press fit. It's tight. So what I do to transfer that measurement, and there's other ways, it's just my way of doing it. I'm going to come out 2 inches just because it's an easy thing to reach. You've got your original, there she is, scribe mark here. Come out here on this lower or smaller reduced diameter, and I'm going to scribe another mark, and right there, and maybe so you won't forget later, 2 inches. So what I'm going to do is, when I go to press this into my CBR bottom yoke, I'm just going to press, and I'll keep an eye on this surface here, and my scribe mark right there, and when I hit 2 inches, then I'll know that I'm right. And just to double check to begin with, you can kind of eyeball this, line it up, and you can tell that it's actually going to be recessed a little bit. It's not going to stick out. It's actually going to sink up in there a touch. So just double check things like this, because if you were doing this and you realize that your stem had to go way into your yoke, then if it set in this far, obviously that's not going to work. You're going to have to create some kind of extension or sleeve or something, and that's just another thing you need to look at. Compare with whatever stem was in the trees originally that you want to use. Compare all these dimensions to the stem that you need to use, which is this one. And as you can tell, the CBR stuff swaps over incredibly easy. Really simple stem swap. Grind the welds off, press it out, mark your distance where you need it protrude out, press it back in, you're done. And of course when you're done, you'll put a couple of tack welds on the bottom to make sure it can never rotate. And that's optional, because if you notice on the newer bikes with all aluminum, they got a stop lip on there. It keeps them from pulling through, or not all of them do. This one does it all, at least. And they're not welded. There's not a lot of force really trying to rotate these things. It's not really needed. But a couple little tacks 180 degrees apart when you're done, good peace of mind. Everything's done. And alright, set over to the lathe or press and stick this together.
I said I was going to press this together, but actually I'm not. And this is something I wanted to go over, and I'm going to tell you why I'm not going to do it. When you go to use a new bottom yoke, you need to sort out your steering stems. And 9 times out of 10, you're going to end up just cutting these off and running some bolts in here or figuring out something. And if you press this stem in here first thing right away, you're going to find out that you can't get your drill in here because your drill chuck's going to be hitting this and everything else. So what you're going to have to do is get all that sorted out, what you can do for steering stops. And of course I can't show this on the video because I don't have a bare frame to work with, but that's another thing you need to take in consideration before you do anything. And of course, while the factory stem is still in place, you can put a bearing on there and hold it up in your steering neck, work it out, see what you got to do. Once you get it pressed apart, get in here, do whatever you got to do, then you're done. So anyway, that's all the information I have on that. I hope it helps somebody.